Have you seen challenges bringing Western concepts into that community? And is it just down to trust and lack of understanding, or are there other factors in that?
Yeah, so I think I think for me the real challenge was when working with the community, how can I meet the community where they're at? So rather than putting myself in that sort of expert position and saying, I'm the psychologist, I'm coming here, I'm going to give you lots of knowledge. You don't know anything. I know everything. Believe me, shut up and sit down. That kind of attitude. I really did not want to adopt that. And it very much doesn't fit with my style of working either. And so for me, a lot of the work started with listening to the community and hearing what it was that they wanted and what they felt was missing for them when thinking about their mental health and thinking about their emotional well-being. And what I was really struck by was how much the women, and because I primarily have worked with women within the community, how much the women were relying on diagnoses and labels as a way of making sense of certain experiences that they were having. So they talk about anxiety, they talk about depression, and they wanted to understand those more. And I suppose I took the perspective of, well, actually, yes, we have a label depression, we have a label of anxiety, but how people experience depression and anxiety varies so much. And you can give quite generalized ideas and understandings of those things, but people will still have very individual experiences as a result of various different, I suppose, life events and things that they've gone through. And so it was less of me trying to bring in Western ideas, but more about how I can use the cultural understanding that people had to understand the role of faith and religion within people's lives to make sense of the Western knowledge that exists. So it's more about how do we shape this Western knowledge in a way that makes sense to people, and actually also being critical of the Western knowledge as well, and not seeing it as that right and the Eastern knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the sort of local knowledge is wrong, but seeing where are there overlaps, where are there differences, and when there are differences and conflict, why do these exist, and where do these ideas come from, and trying to hold that, again, curious and critical position with the community. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I had faced after I'd introduced these ideas was that people initially didn't want to engage in those critical dialogues. They wanted me to just come in and tell them, this is what depression is, and this is how you fix it. Or this is anxiety, and this is how you get rid of it. And again, that didn't sit with the way in which I work. And so I would ask them, well, what is it about these things that you're interested in, and why is it that you're interested in this way? And the reality is that people really struggle with distress, and people don't want to be distressed. And so they want that quick fix, or they want that solution, and they want to, get from A to Z as quickly as possible. And what they don't realize is that it's a painful journey to do that work. And what I was encouraging people to do was draw on cultural and religious practices as a way of creating ease in that process. So if someone believes in the power of prayer, how do you incorporate prayer in your journey as a way of finding peace and finding a way to manage in moments of distress? How do you think about cultural practices when we're thinking about caring for ourselves when we're having a particularly difficult time? And just trying to marry up some of those ideas. And I think initially it was hard for women to relate to this idea that I was coming in as the so-called expert, but didn't want to hold that expert position. And they were constantly like, but you're the one who's supposed to have all the answers. And it's not always the best thing to hear when someone says, actually, I don't have all the answers, because that was the reality. I didn't have all the answers. And again, it's how I would approach my clinical work as well, just meeting people where they're at and trying to understand what is going on for them and how they're coming to a place, and understanding how we can adopt the language, the knowledge that we have to fit and make sense to people. I think when it comes to things like the vaccine, on the other hand, where perhaps there is much more, I suppose, there's this idea that there's this solid scientific evidence and this grounding for this. I think it's more interesting and more important for us to try and understand when there's hesitancy, why that hesitancy exists. And part of it can be down to historical factors, part of it can be down to not knowing, part of it can be down to actually science has been weaponized in previous, within the history of within our lives, but beyond as well. Science has been weaponized against people to, again, marginalize and to oppress. We don't have to look very far toward, like the eugenics movement, where science was used as a basis of discriminating against people who were Black or who were not white or who were disabled. And so it's easy to see how mistrust can build towards these sort of scientific ideas. And I think if we try and understand where some of that hesitancy comes from and address that in the best way that we possibly can, then maybe we're in a better position, again, to engage in that dialogue and be able to work with people rather than thinking, I'm right, you're wrong, that's it. So, yeah, lots of challenges, but I think that's part of the work and that's part of the nature of the work.